From Vassar College, this is Conversations at the Salt Line with Wesley Dixon. On this episode, a conversation with J. Charles Johnson.
Hello, everyone. My name is Wesley Dixon, and welcome to Conversations at the Salt Line. Today, I'm so excited to welcome our guest, former Secretary of Homeland Security and Dutchess County native, Secretary Jeh Johnson. Jeh, thank you for being here.
Wes, I have to note that up until 2 weeks ago, I was probably the most famous graduate of Royce Ketchum High School in Wappingers Falls, New York. That has changed in the last 2 weeks. I'm very proud to say the most famous graduate of Royce Ketchum High School in Wappingers Falls, New York today is Tyler Adams, the captain of the U.S. soccer team.
Yes, it's all over the news. We all know Tyler.
Yes.
And I think it's fair to say, depending on who you ask, Tyler might be the most famous graduate. Depending on who you ask, you might be the most famous graduate. So you can share the title with Tyler.
If you ask me, he is the most famous graduate. And
you don't want the spotlight, do you? You're happy to give it to somebody else.
Immensely proud watching this young man on the world stage handle himself so well.
I'm sure. Well, we have something in common, you and I, when I first moved to Hudson Valley, actually moved to Wappingers, not knowing what it was, and sort of found myself in the middle of this place that was strange to me. I don't know what it was like when you grew up there, but it was very different. I'm from Fort Lauderdale, so it was very different for me to in Wappingers from Broward County, but I made it work. I found a place for myself.
My son lives in Fort Lauderdale right now. He's a member of the Coast Guard. He loves
wonderful. Wonderful.
Yes.
Broward County is a great place to be. Secretary Johnson, there's a first actually that you have on our podcast series here at Conversations at the Salt Line. It's not that you're the first Morehouse man. I had the privilege of talking to Dr. Eddie Glaude a couple of weeks ago.
I saw him this morning in the MSNBC green room.
For Morning Joe, right?
Yes, exactly. At 6 a.m. Right.
So he beat you to the punch in terms of Morehouse on the Vassar podcast, but you are the first guest of mine that does not have an easily findable Instagram or Twitter account. I can hypothesize why that is, but I'll let it go.
I am not on social media.
I wonder if that's maybe because you know too much from your different roles about the risk of social media that it's easy to stay off of it.
I suppose that is correct. I also believe that social media makes one vulnerable to impulse, which I don't want to, it's a place I don't want to be. And I figure I'm just better off not crawling down that rabbit hole.
I think many people would be better off. They don't take the same advice that you've taken for yourself, though. Secretary Johnson, there's so much that we can talk about, and we will talk about a lot, particularly related to your professional career. But I wanted to start off just here in Dutchess County and hear a little bit about what it was like for you growing up in the Hudson Valley, growing up on or near Vassar's campus. It's a very special way to live as a young person, sort of being proximate to so many people who are at a very transitional point in their life. So what was it like for you doing that for numerous years?
I was born on September 11th, 1957. My sister was 2 years younger than me. I was born in New York City. My father at the moment then was still a student at the Columbia School of Architecture. He got his degree in 1958. For the first 5 years of my life, we lived in Corona, Queens, which at the time was sort of a semi-suburban haven for Black folks who were leaving Manhattan. Louis Armstrong lived a block away in Corona. Cannonball Adderley lived in the same apartment building we lived in. In 1963, my father decided he wanted to take his architecture practice to upstate New York. And he went into business with a friend of his from school named Bill Gindel. Together, they formed the architecture firm Gindel and Johnson. They had an office at 6 Liberty Street in downtown Poughkeepsie. When we first moved up to Dutchess County, we lived in Pleasant Valley, just off Route 44. It was like the TV show Green Acres.
It's true.
The city, and we moved to a farmhouse,
right,
a dairy farm that we rented for a year before we could find a permanent home up there. And my sister and I were so used to city lights, city noise. We had to sleep with the lights on in the house. There were cattle in our backyard. It was an enormous change. And a year later, in 1964, we found a home on Cottam Hill, and that became our permanent home, and that's where I grew up. Now, what was it like? I'm a product of the Poughkeepsie Day School. My father, incidentally, designed the Poughkeepsie Day School adjacent to the Vassar campus in 1964 or so. It is now the headquarters for the public safety force at Vassar.
Oh, that building.
And there weren't many Black folk in Dutchess County in 1964. There were almost none in the immediate community where we lived on Cottam Hill. We were probably the first Black family to arrive on Cottam Hill in 1964. Wappingers Falls, where Cottam Hill is, was largely a blue-collar Italian town. The main employer was a bleachery at the bottom of the falls in Wappingers Falls. And ironic turn of events, we moved next door to a family named DeMarco, 6 kids, and the local dentist. And years later, 30 years later, I ended up marrying the girl next door, Susan DeMarco, and we've been married now for almost 29 years. But for me, growing up as a young Black boy in a community like Wappingers Falls was a challenge, without a doubt. Felt very much like an outsider going to school, going to public school. Poughkeepsie Day School was more nurturing, I have to say. But going to the public school, Wappingers Junior High, Royce E. Ketchum High School, it was a challenge. I felt very much like an outsider. I had a nurturing immediate family situation, which I attribute to a lot of my own attitudes and success and positive outlook in life. But going to public school in Southern Dutchess County in the 60s and 70s was a challenge, without a doubt. But I feel as though I'm a better person for it. I went through radical change when in 1975, I left Dutchess County and became a freshman at Morehouse College. I have to say that was my mother and father's idea, not mine. I was a C&D student. I really didn't care. But they had the idea to send me to an HBCU in the mid-1970s. My father grew up on the campus of Fisk University, another HBCU. His father was president of Fisk. And so my father was well acquainted with Black colleges and thought it was a good idea for me to go to Morehouse. I visited Morehouse my senior year in high school. I happened to visit on homecoming weekend.
Oh, gosh.
And it was one of those moments in life where I walked into the situation, I immediately felt at home.
Right.
The place was calling me. And so making the decision to go to Morehouse over Fisk, those were my two choices, was a fairly easy one.
Wonderful. Just one quick question about HBCU culture, since we just talked about it for a brief moment. What words of advice or reactions do you have to Coach Prime in his potentially changing job status in the next football season? I'm a child of a Jackson State alumni, so I have a bias I should disclose as I ask this question.
Well, the HBCU community is remarkable. It's one that I've never forgotten, and to a certain extent, it never leaves you.
Right.
I remember hearing at a Morehouse graduation. I don't remember whether it was mine or somebody else's, but I remember hearing at a Morehouse graduation, when you leave this place for the rest of your life, you will look for situations that replicate the Morehouse experience, whether it's the barbershop, the fraternity meeting, the reunion. You will look for situations to replicate your experience at Morehouse. And I have, in the 30, whatever it is, 43 years since I finished Morehouse, I have found that to be true.
Got it.
43, I've lost count, however many years it is.
It's all good. It's all good. So, Secretary Johnson, of course, people know you for lots of different things. I would imagine most know you for your role as Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. But before that, you had a career, you had a life, and you had things that I imagine prepared you for that role. Most notably, I would think, roles as General Counsel both at the Air Force and the Department of Defense. I'm curious, what were your biggest lessons you learned from those roles? And I've heard you say that the former of those two roles is one of the most intellectually challenging jobs you've ever had. So I would love to hear about those experiences and what you could take from those that we could learn about.
My first job in public service when I was a younger lawyer was to be an assistant United States attorney, a federal prosecutor in Manhattan. I got that job hired by Rudy Giuliani in 1988. I was a young associate in this law firm, this very law firm where I'm sitting now, Paul Weiss. And I got the job. I wanted the job. I always wanted that job coming out of law school. I knew at some point I wanted to interrupt my career in a corporate law firm to become a federal prosecutor. I did that job for 3 years, and it was probably the best job I ever had because I had lots of autonomy. I was going to court every day. I was trying cases, doing good for the public safety. It was a lot of fun. I came back to this law firm in 1992. I became a partner at this law firm, the first African-American partner of this law firm in 1994. And then 4 years later, I got the public service itch again and reached out to some friends in the Clinton administration. I was thinking in conventional terms. Department of Justice or White House counsel's office, and the Office of Presidential Personnel in the Clinton White House reached out to me and said, how would you like to be general counsel of the Air Force? And I had no idea what that was. I didn't even know the job existed. I was never in the US military. I'd never even set foot in the Pentagon. And nevertheless, I decided to learn more about the job. The more I learned, the more interested I became. And in retrospect, though it was a huge learning experience, it was my pathway into national security, and it was totally unanticipated. I did that job for the last 27 months of the Clinton administration. I left. I came back to Paul Weiss in 2001 again. And 5 years later, I met Senator Barack Obama, who recruited me to his presidential campaign at the ground floor. And I did a lot of different things for his campaign. I was also part of his transition team. And at that moment, it was pretty obvious that I was going to be asked to be general counsel of the Department of Defense, be a natural stepping stone up from being general counsel of the Air Force, which is a subsidiary of the Department of Defense.
Right.
It was also an important time to be the senior legal official for DOD. Post 9/11, we were wrestling with the legality around our counterterrorism operations, Guantanamo Bay, don't ask, don't tell, a whole host of things. So it was an important time to be the senior legal official at the Department of Defense. I did that job for 4 years. I was very much anticipated that I would do that job. And then I left in 2013, came back to this law firm yet again. Like a bad penny, I keep coming back. And in fact, if you look in this desk drawer filled with junk, there is written in the drawer each place that this desk has lived. It's had 2 tours in the Pentagon.
Oh my goodness.
1 tour at DHS. But anyway, I came back to this firm in 2013 and was stunned 8 months later when President Obama asked me to be Secretary of Homeland Security. I never saw that coming.
Wow.
So the moral of the story, the takeaway from all of that is 2 out of the 4 jobs I had in public office were ones that were totally unanticipated.
Right.
But I was open-minded enough to seriously consider them.
Wonderful.
And glad I did.
I'm so sure many of us are glad you did too. Reflecting back on at least those first 2 experiences that you just mentioned in public service, these 2 general counsel roles, and then of course your role after that, what has been sort of your guiding framework of how to approach this sort of public service work in government? It obviously isn't for everyone. It's complicated. People have different thoughts about how government should work, but what are your thoughts about how to approach those sort of roles and how to maximize their impact for the American public?
So in the role of being a legal official,
Right.
a politically appointed legal official in national security, there are times when you have to say no, or there are times when you have to stand for the rule of law, contrary to where your client, the US military, really wants to go. And in those moments, I would say to myself, this is why the president put me here, to do the right thing, and not just simply check a box and say, yes, it is legally sufficient. And there were moments when I had to do exactly that. And I think that though it was hard at the moment, in the longer term, I think people appreciated me for that. Having to make that hard decision, so long as the client, the commanders, the secretary, the operators in the field know that you understand what's implicated and what's involved, and that you thoroughly understand the issues. So there are times when the lawyer has to stand up for the rule of law, and the lawyer can't fudge answers like a policy advisor does. Say, well, maybe this, maybe that, maybe if you learned a little more of this, maybe that, this is what I think. You have to say, especially if it's like a lethal force operation, you have to say red light or green light. You have to come down one way or the other. Your choice is binary. And there's some tough calls to be made in those circumstances. And sometimes you don't have a lot of time to make them. The first time I was asked to weigh in on a counterterrorism operation as general counsel of DOD, I was told, here's the objective, here's the collateral damage assessment, here's the objectives, terrorist activities and affiliations. You have 35 minutes before it's light in that part of the world. So I didn't have a whole lot of time to think about this and go crack some law books. I had to make informed but prompt judgments.
In those 35 minutes in that example, what would have been the first thing you would have done to help make your judgment?
Look for my closest advisors on these issues that look at these things a lot more than me. That's number one. But in looking at a counterterrorism operation in particular, I would ask myself three questions. One, is it consistent with the laws of armed conflict? Two, do we have domestic legal authority for this operation, and do we have international legal authority for this operation? Those are the basic three questions.
That makes a lot of sense. I guess I would channel maybe some of our students and others who are less familiar with the way the government works, particularly in counterterrorism, and wonder and ask you, where in your criteria is there an ethical question, if at all, right? Or a moral question? Maybe there isn't room for that. But of those three things, that was not what you listed in those three things. So I'm curious how and if you incorporated that into your calculus in these kinds of decisions.
So there are things that are considered lawful but awful. And then there are things that may be lawful, but on a personal level, you're just not comfortable with, because it crosses a moral boundary or an ethical boundary. The lawyer, and I'm speaking in terms of the lawyer, not the secretary, not the president, not the four-star commander, the lawyer has to render a legal judgment and make it clear that this is a legal judgment. The role of the lawyer is to prescribe the lanes in which the policymakers and the commanders operate. The lawyer might have, if you have the trust and respect of your client, the lawyer might have the room to say, this is lawful but awful. This is lawful, but here are some additional considerations you might consider, you might think about, making clear that those additional considerations are not legal, because if the lawyer says you can't do something, it's full stop, it's a red light. But lawyers do tend to be sensitive to issues of morality, and people's standard for morality can differ. Issues of ethics, we tend to be sensitive to those issues. Or a particular operation might be legal, but it just doesn't make sense.
Right.
In those circumstances, you have to take care as the lawyer to make it clear this is not a legal judgment. This is a policy judgment. This is a judgment of ethics, morality, so forth. But it's legally available if you choose to use it.
Understood. So at some point in your career, you transitioned from being the lawyer in the role to being a trained lawyer in a different role, like secretary, right? You transitioned
Yes.
into being Secretary of Homeland Security. You know, during that time, you were overseeing many different functions, including immigration and migration. And of course, you know, there's been much said about the work of DHS during your time and thereafter in terms of immigration and migration. If you would allow me for a minute, how I have learned to think about organizations is an analogy with cell biology that sort of posits that organizations work like a cell and that they have sort of a semi-permeous membrane. And the goal of the president or CEO is to really manage the boundary between the organization and the outside world, in this sense, the cell and the body. And there's sort of meant to be a sort of healthy fluidity among the cell that keeps it alive. It reacts to illness, virus, whatever. Obviously, in immigration and migration is a very similar analog. There's movement between nation states, people are what's coming in and out of the cell. Sort of simply put, or generally speaking, in your role as DHS secretary, how did you think about managing the boundary, at least intellectually, between this country and others, but most notably Mexico and the southern US border?
So that's a big question.
Yeah.
Let me start with this. The Department of Homeland Security has many missions, many roles. You've touched on one of them, border security and immigration. There's also cybersecurity, aviation security through TSA, maritime security through the Coast Guard, protection of our national leaders, including the president, through the Secret Service, response to natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, tornadoes through FEMA, protection of federal buildings through the Federal Protection Service, naturalizations, DACA, administering DACA. I'm sure you're familiar with that program. So there are 22 components and a wide variety of missions within DHS. Immigration, border security was one of the things I had to think about, but it was definitely the hardest issue to wrestle. And I wrestled in public office with a lot of really, really tough issues. We are a sovereign nation with borders. We have to regulate those borders. We have to know who's entering and leaving our country. We have to know what products are entering and leaving our country. Illegal or irregular migration is a tough issue. And the way I approached tough issues, Wes, I wanted to understand the issue at a macro level and a micro level. But you cannot be driven to make policy decisions simply at the micro level. Right. You have to look at the big picture to make a policy judgment. At a micro level, I'd go to the southern border. I'd visit McAllen, Texas, Laredo, El Paso, the border in Arizona. I'd see the kids, I'd see the families, I'd see the women and children. And as a father, my heart would go out to them and I'd want to scoop them up and take them all back to Washington with me on my airplane. Or if I encountered a little girl who reminded me of my own daughter, I would say to the Border Patrol agent, I want to keep track of this little girl. I want to know what happens to her. And there was a point beyond which
they said we can't.
they don't want you to know because
Right.
they don't want you tracking somebody. So,
Right.
So on a micro level, you have to bring a heart and soul to the job. And at a macro level, you have to look at the broader picture. You have to look at the broader policy perspective and try to reach the best decision with both in mind. Sometimes that can lead to a decision that is very unpopular. Sometimes it can lead to a decision that has disastrous consequences. So, for example, during the Obama administration, was presented with the idea of family separation as a way to control the numbers of those crossing our border illegally, as a deterrent. And I rejected the idea. It was presented to me by the very same people that presented it to people in the Trump administration. And I rejected the idea unequivocally because as a parent, I could not ask a Border Patrol agent or an ICE enforcement officer to take a child away from his or her mother.
So just to your point, so that decision-making moment was sort of pulling on the influence of the micro data you pulled from.
Correct. That is exactly right. I had a visual image in my head of those times when I would go to the border and I would see a young mother clinging to her newborn child. And I could not ask a Border Patrol agent, take that baby away from that mother. That was a non-starter in my judgment. Well, we have to secure our border, but there are just going to have to be other ways to do that. The decision-making at the upper echelons of government is multidimensional. You can never act solely on your personal level of comfort. If it's an easy decision, it shouldn't have reached your desk in the first place.
Right.
And so you have to make the best decision based on a variety of different factors. Some policy, some security, some political, but you have to make the best decision that you're comfortable with given the range of things you have to consider.
It's helpful. It's very helpful. One of the things that you mentioned you were overseeing during your time as secretary was, we might call it counterterrorism or domestic terrorism. Maybe they're the same thing or part of the same family of things. And I actually was struck to hear you say in a different conversation that one of the things you're most proud of is that during your time as secretary, you all increased or supported funding of local organizations that were tasked with really spurring conversation as a means to address counterterrorism, at least domestically, is what I heard. And I think you referenced an organization in Chicago when you were talking about this the first time. My recollection was you saying that the conversations were with people who had either left or been pulled from domestic terrorist groups or sort of fringe groups, and sort of really bring them into the fold in sort of a restorative justice sort of way. You didn't use that word, I'm using that word, but that's sort of what I took from it. That seems incredibly amazing to me. And what I really would love to hear from you is, what can we learn, we as the American public who often aren't doing that sort of work, what can we learn from people who have left extremist radical groups, and what should we do with that information to sort of support less of that happening over time in our society?
So there's been a steady evolution that I have observed in the terrorist threat to our homeland and in our counterterrorism efforts. When I first got into this in 2009, at the beginning of the Obama administration, when I was at DOD, we were still wrestling with what I refer to as foreign terrorist directed acts. In other words, a foreign terrorist organization like Al Qaeda or ISIS will direct a large scale terrorist attack here in the homeland, like the shoe bomber or the underwear bomber, or of course, 9/11. We evolved over the years to about 2014, 2015 to what we refer to as terrorist inspired acts, where a foreign terrorist organization, again, ISIS or Al Qaeda, will inspire over the internet somebody who was already here in the United States to commit a smaller scale attack, like a mass shooting. And we saw a spate of those in 2014, 2015, San Bernardino, for example, which was, I think, November 2015, November, December 2015. There was a spate of these, the nightclub in Florida. And now, in this phase, we're wrestling with domestic-based violent extremism, inspired domestically, not by a foreign terrorist organization. And when we were in the phase of foreign terrorist-inspired acts, I determined that we needed to embark upon a tour here in the United States where I would engage local organizations, local law enforcement, to meet throughout the nation, principally then with Muslim community leaders. And over time, I spent a lot of time doing this. I went to at least a dozen cities with this kind of program. I then had the opportunity in August of 2016 to address the Islamic Council of North America at their annual convention in Chicago. It's a big deal. I was the most senior member of the US government to ever address that convention, and got some controversy from the right for doing so. How can you talk to this group? I mean, they're honest, hardworking Americans, just like you and me. And the moment I will never forget, in preparation for that address, one of the leaders of the organization said, you're going to be talking to 10,000 American Muslims. Don't use this opportunity to deliver the message, don't be a terrorist. Don't give a security speech. Don't give a speech about, if you see something, say something from your nephew or your neighbor. Talk about the promise of America. And I thought that was spot on, exactly right. And that's exactly what it did. Mm. Now, all through this, we began to see warning signs of domestic-based violent extremism. Congressman Benny Thompson, who was, Chairman Thompson of the January 6th committee, was someone who was really ringing this alarm for me. And we decided in my last year in office to ask Congress to help us fund community-based organizations to keep people from turning away from hate. And I was pleasantly surprised to find out that there were organizations devoted to doing exactly that for white nationalist extremism. Organization in Chicago called Life After Hate. I don't know if it's named that anymore. And dedicated to reforming neo-Nazis or people who have left that movement, helping bring them back to society. And with those types of organizations, which I think we need a lot more of, we're in a position to understand fully what are the indicators of a journey toward danger, and how do you pull somebody back from the brink before the FBI, law enforcement has to get involved. There are some real telltale signs. If I could just spend a moment more on this topic. There's a study done by a Professor Robert Pape, University of Chicago. He studied the demographics of those arrested on January 6th, 2021. What's interesting and surprising is that most of those arrested on January 6th for the insurrection, and that's what it was, an insurrection, were from blue counties in blue states, not red counties in rural red states like Wyoming or Idaho. They're from blue counties in blue states, Putnam County, New York, or northern New Jersey,
or Broward County,
or Connecticut. What does that tell you? It tells you that these people are motivated by the so-called Great Replacement, and they're afraid of what they see as the Great Replacement taking place in their own backyard, which brought them to the US Capitol on January 6th. That and the belief that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. And I found that highly illuminating. In other words, most of the intense hatred and racism that we see comes from people who live in communities right next door to those of us who are people of color, not, in remote areas of the Northwest. And so that's a place where we need to start. And that's a place where we need to start having these types of conversations in close proximity to one another. So that was a very long-winded answer to your question. I could go on, but
no, it was
lessons learned.
It was helpful. I have read some, not as much, I'm sure, as you, of Robert Pape's work, and familiar with that particular study. I'm curious, sort of how we think about alienation and isolation as a part of that, the implication of that research, right? Because one might also argue that these people are motivated by the great replacement theory, and as a part of that or separate from that, are just feeling lonely, right? They are not in a place where they feel like they are part of a community that's sizable enough that they can be a part of, right? So that's not the same thing what you're saying. It's a little bit different. And I'm wondering if that has any implication for how we address people like that in those communities. It might not just be conversation. They may not feel like they can talk because there's no one to talk with, right? So how do we not just sort of bring people together in sort of a, like, let's all talk together, but how do we even connect people to folks who might be like-minded, assuming it's not violent and inciting any sort of hate? But how do we start to create those bridges even within communities where they don't seem to exist?
So the human mind is complicated. Mental health is complicated.
Yeah.
Very often, as you've noted, violent behavior, a mass shooting in a school, for example, starts with someone who's felt ostracized,
right,
put aside, ridiculed, made to feel alone, made to feel different. It's one of the indicators of a march toward potential violent behavior, but not the only indicator. And those who are dangerous far-right nationalists are not necessarily people who are loners. You look at the groups that converged on Charlottesville in August 2017. Those were groups of people with a dedicated leadership. Many of the January 6th insurrectionists were part of an organization. These were not people who were simply living on the fringe of society someplace. And so racist attitudes can take all sorts of forms and stem from all sorts of places. One of the things that I continually stress is that Jews and Blacks have a common enemy. And so anytime, and I said this to a leader of a Jewish organization just a couple of nights ago, anytime anti-Semitism creeps out in the Black community, we have to address it, reply to it loudly. Anytime racism creeps out in the Jewish community, we have to stamp it out, address it forcefully, and stand against the common enemy. And racism does not discriminate. Racists tend to hate all of us who are different, not just because of your skin color, or not just because of your religion, not just because of your nationality, not just because you come from South America. Racism tends to hate us all.
I think we all can agree on that. I have one last question before I do a quick round of hot seat questions from our students. In thinking about some current problems that you might have dealt with in some form when you were in office as secretary. Of course, immigration and migration has not gone away as sort of a hot button issue for this country. I've heard you say recently that as part of a comprehensive plan that you would hope Congress and the executive branch takes to address this, that we would think about supporting movement of migrants to the interior of the country in ways that don't, I imagine, don't focus them only on border states and overwhelm those states. Am I right in interpreting that as your opinion or one of your views?
Yes.
Okay.
So if you have crossings at the rate of 200,000 a month,
right,
we cannot ask border states to absorb that population by themselves. There needs to be a national level coordinated effort, if they're going to be here, to more effectively and efficiently integrate them into the interior, rather than leaving it to Governor Abbott of Texas and Governor DeSantis of Florida to do that.
Right.
There needs to be a more coordinated effort. You talk to people at DHS, they say, we don't have the authority or the money to move people once they've been released by the Border Patrol and ICE, but there needs to be a national level coordinated effort at this.
It makes sense. When I heard you say that, I have to say that I, from not a policy point of view, from sort of a linguistic point of view, really liked it, because of course the metaphor is that you're sort of absorbing people into the center of the country as opposed to keeping them on the fringes. Of course, that's not how life actually works, but I really appreciated the visual of thinking about having people who are coming at our borders not sort of stay again on the periphery, but rather find a way to get them fully integrated into our country. As hard as it might be, I think it could be an important thing for us to aspire to. Secretary Johnson, this has been great talking to you. Our students, as you know from growing up on and near our campus, are really inquisitive people. And so they have submitted 3 questions they wanted me to ask you as part of our conversation. So the first is, what is the most surprising thing that you learned about Vassar from your father?
Well, I used to go with my father to commencements in the spring. I always loved looking at all the different robes and the colors and everything. The most surprising thing was, over the years, the students get smaller.
Oh.
In other words, I grew up and got bigger, but in my eyes, the students got smaller. So when I was a little kid and my father would have his annual cookout at the end of the school year, I was looking at big people, adults. And then over the years, as I grew up, they got smaller,
Right.
to the point where I was older than the college students that he was bringing home.
Right.
And so, yes, that was a surprise. The students get smaller as time passes.
That's fun. The second thing is, what role does not currently exist in government that you think should exist?
That's a good question. No one's asked me that. What role does not exist in government that should exist?
You can't say crypto regulator. That's too easy.
I would say that there needs to be, this is off the top of my head, because it's a question I've never been asked to think about it before. There needs to be an effort dedicated to, in a comprehensive way, encouraging young people, college-age people, to think about national service. Not the US military, but national civilian service. Encouraging people to follow the words of John F. Kennedy. And even if it is for just a brief period of 3, 4, 5 years, we ought to figure out a way to encourage people, young people, into national service, perhaps give them a break on their student debt, so that as young people, we're oriented to serving our country.
Amazing.
Having that common shared experience. So it'd be great if there was an agency dedicated to exactly that.
Yeah, I'm sure the folks at AmeriCorps think they're doing that, but to your point, I think there can be much more than what AmeriCorps offers. I remember
I'm talking about at an agency level,
an
organization dedicated solely to this.
Yeah, I remember when I was in school, it was new for me to hear this concept. I had classmates who were from wherever, Singapore, Nigeria, whatever, and they were freshmen at 24 years old or whatever, and they had done their national service that was compulsory. And it was such a new concept as an American to think about people, doing some sort of compulsory national service. So I think there's lots of room for that here. And the third question is probably a really simple one for you, but being the son of an architect, what is your favorite building? And I won't put any constraints on it, not in the country, in the world, whatever you want. What is your favorite building?
Well, first, you have to know what my hobby is.
Oh, what is it?
And I'm about to show you. This is my hobby.
Is that a train?
Yes, that's
Okay.
in my basement.
Oh, is it? Oh, okay. Wow. I
So
can't quite see. Is it a
that's
model
my
train?
that's my train set. Yes, that is a
Do
model
you?
train, and you can see all the infrastructure that exists around it. My favorite buildings are train stations. My favorite train station is Cincinnati Union Terminal in Cincinnati, Ohio. It looks like a big amphitheater.
Hmm.
Mural inside Cincinnati Union Terminal was painted by an artist named Winold Reese. Yes, there's an architect in me. Second favorite train station is probably Washington Union Station. And then there are a host of others. Grand Central Station, of course, is beautiful. There are smaller stations around the nation. So train stations, I love train stations. I love the architecture behind train stations. And there are a lot of train stations now that are being refurbished into event spaces that are really
Yes.
beautiful.
The Atlanta train depot. I had a wedding, not my wedding. I went to a wedding in the Atlanta train depot. You should know you'd have a friend in my father. My father in his office today at home has a train set. And when I was growing up, every year he would buy, for me and for him, he would buy a Lionel sort of holiday novelty train card to add to his collection. And so now I've aged out of my train interest, but now there are little people in the community who come over to the house just to see the trains run on the train set that my dad has collected for a long time. So that's the point of comment I didn't know we would have.
Okay.
It's wonderful. Well, Secretary Johnson, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me and to us today. I've learned a lot. I'm sure our listeners will too. And learning about you balancing lots of different priorities, something that people can apply to their lives in a variety of ways. So thank you for sharing that wisdom with us here on the Salt
I'm
Line.
happy to do this. I want to dedicate this podcast to the memory of my father, J.V. Johnson, who taught at Vassar for 37 years. Just a couple of weeks ago, my family and I visited Vassar for the renaming ceremony for the Alana Center. And it was a great honor. And I know my father is looking down with a smile on his face. He never would have dreamed having a building named for him on the campus, particularly a campus where so many of the buildings are ones he designed.
Right. Well, he is happy. We're happy for him and happy for you and grateful for you. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.